What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back for what is rapidly becoming one of the highlights of my weekly routine, and that is reviewing the latest episode of The Expanse. Episode 9 of Season 3 is called Intransigence, and sadly we're starting to look at the end of the season. There are only 4 episodes left. But because I started to recognize that the end is in sight, I actually started to dip my toes back into the books. I've taken like a year off from the books, but I started reading the 4th book, Cibola Burn, recently, and I'm absolutely loving it. And also, this is totally unrelated to The Expanse, but if anybody out there is looking for some great science fiction with which to occupy their time, I'm also reading the book Hyperion by Dan Simmons. As a result of my reviews of the show The Terror, people were recommending some of his other books, and Hyperion is just absolutely blowing my mind. It's as good as science fiction gets. But before I get to tonight's recap and review, I did want to give a brief shout out to some of the comments that I got on last week's video. If you've been following my channel for a while, you know that a lot of my videos suffer from a rather spasmodic kind of editing style, and usually that's because I'm editing out all my stutters and all my slurs and all the times where I just mumble my words. I have a very hard time putting more than a few words together in a row in a coherent fashion. But someone pointed out that my editing style reminded them of Miller over the last couple episodes, how he kind of stops and starts in the middle of his sentences. And I will take that as a compliment because I absolutely love and adore Miller. But I will make you a promise that moving forward, I will endeavor to record at least longer sentences so that the cuts are less abrupt and annoying and less frequent. A lot of people after last week also were calling attention to the fact that they really missed the character Bull. Bull, for people who have read Abaddon's Gate, the 3rd book, he's a major character in that novel. And I suggested that a lot of his actions were probably going to get folded in with the character of Ashford. But a lot of people also pointed out wisely that perhaps Naomi was going to play that role on the Behemoth. But as we saw in tonight's episode, that is not going to be the case because Naomi is coming home to her family. And in these videos, I typically enjoy talking a little bit about current events and news surrounding a show before diving into my review and recap. There just wasn't really anything new since the announcement that Amazon was going to be the custodian of the show moving forward. So in the absence of any current events to discuss, let's just dive right into this week's review. So after last week's absolute nail-biter of an episode, this episode seemed to take its foot off the gas just a little bit as all the various characters are trying to figure out what the laws of physics are, basically, on the other side of the ring. It's basically a giant bubble with this mysterious nucleus at the center, and if any ship or torpedo tries to fly higher than a certain speed, they either get stopped or they completely lose control over the direction. And also, as we see from a lot of the probes that are floating around, touching the outside edge of the bubble is also ill-advised. So as expected, Amos is not entirely psyched when he learns about the cameraman's treachery for his role that he played in launching the video that got them in such hot water. As I've said before, Amos is rapidly becoming one of my favorite characters on the show, mostly because they have found a way to make him incredibly hysterical without him losing any of his lethal, hardcore edge. But as Amos starts to go berserk, the cameraman acknowledges he didn't know the full extent of the plan. Amos is not entirely satisfied with that answer, and in a rare burst of truly savage anger, he basically holds up a screwdriver to Monica's neck and threatens to kill her if the cameraman doesn't divulge all the information that he has. And while Amos is typically happy just to go wherever Holden leads, in this case we see him actually taking the initiative, and he decides to suit up Monica and her cameraman, but he basically kicks them off the ship, instructing them to tell the other ships that are pursuing them that the Rossi had nothing to do with the act of sabotage in the previous episode. Holden continues to lose his ship because he's unable to get a hold of Miller. While Miller was particularly chatty leading up to the ring, he has mysteriously gone completely silent. And while I wouldn't say Holden is necessarily the funniest person in the show, we do get this great bit where Alex comes down to check on him, and Holden opens the door and just glares at him and then closes the door back, and we hear him just screaming Miller's name. Which I'm thoroughly enjoying because while Holden is very stoic and he's very heroic and he's very brave, he can be a little one-dimensional in terms of just being the pure, well-intentioned captain at times. So it's nice to see him fall to pieces a little bit. But this episode also starts to get political when the MCRN goes through the ring, briefly comes back out, and announces to the UN as well as to the Belters, we got the situation in hand, we're going to apprehend Holden, everybody else back off. And I feel like the fastest way to get a Belter to do something is to tell them not to do something. And when Drummer hears that, she basically says, look, it was a Belter who awakened the ring and first tried to go through, and so we're going to do precisely what we want. Naomi's obviously relieved to hear that her friends are okay, and after she does a few repairs on the Behemoth to get things up and running again, Drummer actually catches her trying to sneak off the ship. And while Drummer implores her to stay aboard the Behemoth to stay with her people, Naomi basically tells her, look, I love my people, I'm definitely a Belter, I'm with you guys all the way, but these are my friends and these are my family, and I do have to go. And Drummer, luckily, does allow Naomi to go after the Rossi in her own little ship. But the major revelation of this episode was seeing the backstory of the character Melba. I can finally discuss Melba without having to tap dance around her true identity, but as we saw in this episode, she is one of the daughters of Julpier Mao. Her real name is Clarissa, and she didn't necessarily have the warmest, sweetest relationship with her sister Julie. We get an insider's look at this party that Melba threw on her sister's behalf, and we see just how much family strife their family's suffering from in spite of all their wealth and power. And it's a strange thing where Julie and her father have nothing but the most horrible things to say to one another. They fight like cats and dogs, but in a strange way, Julpier Mao really respects and admires Julie and believes that she has the fire and determination to carry their name into the future. And he very condescendingly says to Melba, a daughter who's been very loyal to him, that all you know how to do is throw parties. So as much as people might be inclined to dislike Melba because of her actions so far, I mean, she murdered a guy, she sabotaged a ship, she blamed it all on Holden. She's determined to ruin Holden's life for what has happened to her family and how her father is now in jail. But she very clearly feels an enormous amount of remorse for the murder that she committed. When she and some of her fellow crew members are going through the guy's logs, Melba feels horrible when she sees that the guy actually held Melba in very high regard, even though he recognized that she was pretty green and had a lot to learn. And it's going to be very interesting to see how her actions continue to weigh on her, because she's trying to get revenge for somebody who doesn't have a lot of respect for her, and she's trying to avenge a sister with whom she did not particularly get along, and she's having to compromise everything about herself as a person in order to make this happen. And for my money, that's always what makes a great villain. A villain can't be 100% evil or they just become boring. A one-dimensional, mustache-twirling megalomaniac. Villains need to be relatable. They need to think they're fighting actually for a good cause to make them truly interesting. It's something I'm always coming back to in my reviews of movies and in television shows, but I always find the most interesting characters to be the villains, but only if they are a truly great multi-dimensional villain. So Melba's definitely become one of the characters I'm enjoying the most in this latter part of season 3. And the last thing I'll say about Melba is that it was interesting seeing her interact with Anna. Anna's a character that I initially was a little reluctant to embrace because I felt like it was a mistake to bring her forward into the events of book 2, and really she just has a home in book 3. But now that we see her interacting with Melba, I feel like her character is fitting much more organically into the narrative, and she's one of the few people aboard the UN ship who does not chicken out and decides to stay aboard because she wants to go to the ring. A lot of other people are evacuating and taking off to some moon because they're terrified about going through the ring. But I would love to get some other people's opinion out there who have read Abaddon's Gate, but it's been over a year since I read that book, but it seems like they're really ripping through the events of that novel very quickly. I feel like while the first book and the second book got kind of stretched in a lot of ways, it seems like they're really compressing the third book, but who knows, maybe they're planning on elongating some of the events in the latter part of the novel. But right now it's looking almost as if they might perhaps wrap up the events of book 3 over the next 4 episodes. But there's so much cool stuff that happens in that novel, I'm hoping they stretch the events of book 3 at least halfway through season 4. But back aboard the Rossi, we see Holden and his allies rapidly running out of options. While they're not in any immediate danger of being shot or torpedoed, because the bubble's having an impact on anybody trying to fire a weapon. And obviously there's kind of a speed limit that every single ship has to maintain, but there's only so far that they can run before they get to the edges of the bubble. And as I saw with one of the probes, that is not something they want to do. But finally, Holden has a very clear conversation with Miller. And because of their proximity to the nucleus, Miller is much more coherent, he's much more clear-headed, and he gives Holden his one out from an unwinnable situation. And Holden decides to suit up, go outside the Rossi, and basically launches himself into space toward the nucleus. As we saw in the teaser for the next episode, Holden tells his friends to back off and to let him go solo. But we also saw in the teaser a reappearance of fan favorite Bobby Draper, and I assumed this was going to happen. Bobby Draper was not in the third book, but because that character has such a massive following, they've decided to insert her back into the crew of Martian soldiers that goes after Holden. And I think if you're going to mess around with the events of the book, that's forgivable, because one of those things where a show is a show and a book is a book. And in a series of books, characters can weave in and out or disappear for a long period of time. But if you're hiring actors to appear in a show, it gets very complicated if you're going to say, hey, we want you for this season, and then you're going to take 3 years off, and then you're going to come back for another season. So it's interesting seeing how the showrunners always try to get around these creative challenges of just the book and the show having completely different formats. But I think on the whole, they're largely successful in adapting the major events of the books and the tone of the book, even if they do make minor adjustments periodically along the way. Something tells me that no matter what adjustments they make to the show, the end goal and the major events between the books and the show will always be the same. In any case, I think I'm going to wrap this video up, but I do want to say one final thing before I bring this video to a close. A lot of people are talking these days on Twitter and social media about quote-unquote toxic fandom when it comes to science fiction and movies and television, I have to say this about the community surrounding The Expanse has to be one of the nicest collection of fans I've ever come across that follows a particular franchise. Whether it's on social media or on the comments on this channel, I would say 99.99% of my interactions have been largely positive, and people seem to be incredibly kind, and they offer their insights, and they also offer scientific expertise. It's just been a really cool experience reviewing and recapping the show, especially as we as a group watch the show nearly meet its demise and then rise from the ashes and get saved by Amazon. So for all of you out there who've been regularly following my channel on reviews of the show, I do thank you, and it is an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be on this voyage following the show with the rest of you fans. But if you want to give me a shout, feel free to do so in the comments below, or you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax. If you would consider subscribing to my channel, I would greatly appreciate it. In the next couple of days, sadly, I will not be able to post any reviews of any kind, but if you want some more content, you can always go over to my podcast, Wrong Reel, where there's almost 400 episodes now to be enjoyed, and I'll be back on this channel Sunday evening to review the latest episode of Westworld. But as always, thank you so much for the support of my channel, and onwards and upwards.